Hey everybody, and welcome back to our recommended read series. In this month's episode, we're going to be talking about Richard Foster's book, Celebration of Discipline. Now, as the title would suggest, this book is about discipline, which is usually not a word that we like to talk about that much. But the discipline that he's talking about in this book is spiritual disciplines and celebrating, performing, and putting into action in our lives spiritual disciplines. Now, if you're a Christian and you've been a Christian for a while, but you've never heard the term spiritual disciplines before, you are not alone. Many people in the church today are not familiar with spiritual disciplines. And this is a real shame because spiritual disciplines have been a backbone of the Christian faith for as long as Christianity has been around. For the last 2,000 years, people have been using spiritual disciplines to grow in their faith. But we, in the modern church, in the modern world, and especially in modern America, don't tend to practice spiritual disciplines. We're told to study and to pray and to do those kind of things. And those are things that we should do. But there are many people out there in this world, and maybe you're one of them, who feel like they're just not getting enough. They're just not growing enough in their spirituality and in their faith. And I think the main reason for this is that we don't teach or practice spiritual disciplines anymore. And in fact, correct and true Bible study and prayer are actually spiritual disciplines that can be practiced. And those are actually two of the spiritual disciplines that Richard Foster talks about in this book. So if you, like me, are a Christian who has wanted just something a little bit more, just wanted to grow in their faith a little bit more, and you're trying to find some concrete ways to do that other than just having somebody tell you, well, you need to go home and open your Bible more, or you need to go and pray more, and you're looking for some of those ways to advance your faith, and to practice some more advanced spiritual growth techniques, this book is for you. In this book, Richard Foster talks about some great techniques that we can use in growing our faith and starting in these spiritual disciplines. As I've already hinted at earlier, two of those that he talks about are prayer and study. And he gives us some advice, some techniques that we could use, that way we can already get better at those two things that hopefully we as Christians are already implementing in our lives to grow in our faith. But he talks about some other things that we may be a little bit less familiar with. Things like the spiritual discipline of meditation. And he makes sure to emphasize the difference between the Eastern meditation that we are often so familiar with and what true Christian meditation is. He also talks about America's least favorite spiritual discipline, which is fasting. And he even points out the fact that we in America tend to worship at the altar of the golden arches. But in this book, he talks about some very instructive and helpful ways that we as Christians, even in our 21st century America, can learn how to fast properly and how we can grow in our faith because of that. He also talks about many more spiritual disciplines, things like simplicity, things like solitude, things like celebration and confession. Of course, not confession that you may be thinking of, where you get into a booth with a priest on the other side. He introduces all these different spiritual disciplines that if you fully invest and put these things into practice, will advance your spiritual life. And I can speak from this firsthand. So as you can already tell, I can say a lot of great things about this book. But before you go to buy it, there are some things I want you, of course, to be aware of. First off, I want to talk about the author, Richard Foster. Now, Richard Foster's faith background is that he is actually a Quaker. And whenever you hear the word Quaker, the first thing you may be thinking of is some oats or maybe some oatmeal in that way. But that is not his background. His background is of the Quaker belief and faith system. Because the Quakers have been a religious sect of the Christian faith for a long time. And he holds to that tradition, which means there are some things that he's going to believe that is, of course, going to be very different than what I believe. He is a little charismatic in his beliefs and what he believes. And so that tends to show in his work in this way. And so as I'll pretty much preference in every single book that I will talk about in this series, I don't always approve of 100% of everything that they say. The only book that I've ever picked up in my entire life where I agreed 100% with everything that was said was the Bible. And even sometimes I've had some issues where I've had to overcome those failures in my life whenever I didn't actually believe it as much as I said I did. And so this book is no different than many of the other books that we've already talked about. Sometimes he says some things that I don't necessarily always agree with. However, the things that he says that are beneficial, that are positive to a good faith life, to these positive spiritual disciplines that we could and should be practicing, far outweigh those negative things that I could point out within this. And he divides these celebrations into 12 different chapters, 12 different disciplines, and so you can pick and choose which disciplines that you want to work on. Just like with anything, I would not suggest that you pick up this book and you try to practice all 12 of these spiritual disciplines at once. That'd go completely against the idea that we should be emphasizing here. My goal would actually be to read this, and maybe read this through slowly, one chapter at a time, picking individual spiritual disciplines that you can perform and trying to implement those things in your life. And if you do that and do those things effectively, I promise you, guarantee you that your spiritual life will be benefited by reading this book. So now it's time to rate Richard Foster's Celebration of Discipline. Now, if I could separate this book into the practical things that really helped me and the other things that were less helpful, then I would say a 10 out of 10 for the things that really helped me, and maybe a 6 out of 10 for the things that didn't so much help me. And you may think then, well, if I take the law of averages, that means it's going to be an 8 out of 10. But no, that's not what I'm going to do. I'm going to give this book a 9 out of 10 because those 10 out of 10 things that are so helpful are just so helpful that I can't give this any less than a 9. So this is absolutely a Moody Ministries recommended read, and I do recommend that you pick this up for your shelf because it does belong in your book collection and off of your shelf and in your hands. Thank y'all so much for being part of this series. Share this with your friends if you feel like you got something out of it and you want to bless them in their reading recommendations as well. If you have any constructive criticism, feedback that you'd like to give, you're always welcome to do that in the comments below. And any recommendations for books that you want us to cover in the series in the future that you would like to give, I'm always willing to be looking out for those and to try to figure out if that's something that we can put into the series. Thank you all so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time.